Settle in and let go. There's nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to hold on to. While the world sleeps, we'll drift slowly into a civilization that left no kings behind. If these carry you off to sleep, subscribe. A new one comes every night. The floor of the Great Bath descends in two directions at once. From the northern end, a set of brick steps leads down toward the water line. From the southern end, another set meets them at the bottom. The tank itself measures approximately 12 meters in length, 7 meters across, and 2.5 meters deep, dimensions precise enough that anyone standing at the rim today can hold them in mind as a room, as a space built to a specific human purpose, as something that required planning and decision and material knowledge to make. The floor was laid in fired brick, set in gypsum mortar. Over the mortar, a layer of bitumen was applied, the same dark waterproofing substance used on boat hulls and water-carrying vessels, pressed into every joint and seam until the basin could hold water without losing it. This was built in roughly 2500 BCE on an elevated mound above the city of Mohenjo-Daro, on the floodplain of the Indus River, in a civilization that has not yet been given a common name by the people who lived inside it. The bitumen is still there. The brick steps descend on both ends. The gypsum mortar has survived 4,500 years of wet seasons and dry seasons, and the accumulated weight of silt and soil pressing down from above, and the tank is still recognizable as a tank, still legible as a room that held water, still structured enough that the angle of its drainage system can be traced from the basin floor to a large corbelled drain in the western wall, through which the water was eventually released. No one agrees entirely on what the water was for. Ritual cleansing is the most common proposal, given the scale and the evident care of construction, and the elevated position on what archaeologists have called the Citadel Mound, set apart from the residential neighborhoods of the lower city below. Other proposals have been made. None of them has been confirmed. The bath simply stands as it was built, precise, watertight, waiting at the center of a question that has been asked for nearly a century of excavation and has not yet been fully answered. It is worth pausing on the bitumen. The substance had to be sourced, transported, heated, and applied by workers who understood what it was meant to do and how to do it correctly. Every joint in the fired brick floor was sealed. The outer faces of the tank walls were sealed as well. Gypsum plaster was applied over the bitumen on the interior surfaces, smoothing the waterproofing into a finished surface that could hold water without seeping and could be cleaned without damage. This is not a project undertaken casually. It required hydraulic knowledge, access to bitumen as a material resource, a workforce capable of executing a technically demanding task at scale, and an administrative system capable of coordinating all of those things across the months it would have taken to complete. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro is, by the consensus of comparative archaeology, the most sophisticated piece of hydraulic engineering produced by any Bronze Age civilization in its period. The Roman baths are 2,000 years later. The Mesopotamian bath complexes of the same era are smaller, simpler, and less technically accomplished in their waterproofing. The Great Bath stands alone in its moment as an achievement, and it stands above a city that produced it without leaving behind a name. Mohenjo-Daro is not the only Indus city, it is simply the largest currently known. The Indus Valley Civilization, at the height of its urban period between roughly 2600 and 1900 BCE, covered approximately 1.5 million square kilometers across what is now Pakistan, northwestern India, and portions of Afghanistan and Iran. That number is large enough to require a pause. 1.5 million square kilometers. Egypt, at its greatest Bronze Age extent, covered a fraction of that area. Mesopotamia, the civilization of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys that produced the first writing systems and the earliest known law codes, occupied a territory considerably smaller. The Indus civilization was the largest Bronze Age civilization on Earth by the measure of geographic footprint, and for most of recorded history, almost no one in the wider world knew it had existed. It was rediscovered in the 1920s when British-led archaeological teams began excavating mounds in the Punjab and Sindh regions of what was then colonial India, and found beneath the surface the remains of cities built to a standard of planning and construction that surprised everyone who looked at them. The grid appears first in photographs as an abstract quality, a regularity, an alignment, a sense that nothing in the architecture is accidental. But the reality of it becomes clearer when the measurements are taken. The major thoroughfares of Mohenjo-Daro run north-south and east-west at right angles to each other, forming a cardinal grid that organizes the city into blocks. The main north-south street is approximately 10 meters wide enough for 2 lanes of wheeled cart traffic to pass each other, with space remaining on either side. Smaller streets branch off at right angles, and smaller lanes branch from those, each narrowing in a consistent pattern from the major arteries toward the interior of each residential block. The city was planned before it was built, not in the sense that a rough scheme was sketched and then approximated in construction, but in the sense that the streets were laid first, the block boundaries established, and the buildings placed within those boundaries in accordance with a spatial logic that held across the entire urban footprint. This grid appears at Harappa, the second great anchor city of the civilization, located roughly 600 kilometers to the northeast of Mohenjo-Daro in what is now Pakistani Punjab. The cardinal orientation is the same. The street hierarchy is the same. The distinction between the elevated western mound, which archaeologists have labeled the citadel at both sites, and the lower city to the east follows the same general pattern. At Tolavira, in the Rann of Kutch in what is now the Indian state of Gujarat, the grid appears again. The city is smaller, its planning somewhat adapted to the island terrain on which it was built, but the underlying spatial logic, cardinal orientation, hierarchical street widths, a distinction between an elevated formal area and a lower residential zone, is recognizably the same logic applied in modified form to a different landscape more than 1,000 kilometers from Mohenjo-Daro. At Kalibangan in Rajasthan, the grid appears again, the same cardinal alignment, the same separation of a raised formal area from a lower residential city. These sites are separated by distances that in the Bronze Age would have required weeks or months of travel. They were built in the same centuries by people who shared a material culture, and the cities they built share a spatial vocabulary that is consistent enough to suggest coordination, not merely cultural similarity, but something more specific, some shared understanding of how a city should be organized that was carried and applied across an enormous territory. The fired bricks tell the same story in a smaller key. Brick is a humble material. It is made from clay, shaped in a mold, dried and fired in a kiln until it hardens. The technology was widely known in the ancient world and produced bricks in many different sizes, depending on local tradition, available materials, and the preferences of local builders. In the Indus civilization, the fired bricks produced at Mohenjo-Daro maintained a consistent dimensional ratio across their 3 faces, approximately 1 to 2 to 4, meaning that the length was twice the width and 4 times the height, a ratio that allows bricks to be stacked and interlocked in multiple orientations without leaving structural gaps. This ratio is not unusual in itself, What is unusual is that this same ratio, 1 to 2 to 4, appears in the fired bricks produced at Harappa, 600 kilometers away, and at Dholavira, more than 1,000 kilometers from Mohenjo-Daro, and at Kalibangan, and at Banawali, and at the dozens of smaller Indus sites where brick production has been studied. The ratio is consistent across the entire civilization to a degree that exceeds what would be expected from independently developed local tradition. A brick resting in two hands, smooth from kiln firing, its proportions exact, its corners sharp, carries in its simple geometry the evidence of an agreement. Someone decided this was the ratio. The decision was communicated, enforced, maintained across distances that involved multiple communities, multiple regional environments, and what must have been a significant administrative challenge of coordination. How that coordination worked through traveling specialists, through shared metrological standards, through centralized production and distribution, or through some other mechanism not yet identified, is not known. The bricks simply exist in their consistent proportions, site after site, telling the same measurement without explaining how the measurement was shared. The weights follow the pattern as well. The Indus civilization used a system of standardized stone weights, small, precisely worked cubes and hemispheres in materials including chert, jasper, and limestone that maintained consistent ratios across the civilization. The smallest denominations are tiny, precise enough to weigh small quantities of valuable materials. The largest are substantial objects. The ratios between them follow a binary and decimal progression that has been partially reconstructed by archaeologists who have weighed surviving examples from multiple sites. The weight system shows the same geographic consistency as the brick ratio, the same proportions found at Mohenjo-Daro, appearing at Harappa, at Dholavira, at sites far to the north and south and east. Trade across the civilization's internal routes would have been conducted using these weights. Transactions between merchants and cities 1,000 kilometers apart would have used objects calibrated to the same standard. The economy of the Indus civilization moved through a shared metrological system of remarkable precision and remarkable geographic reach. Mohenjo-Daro, the largest known city of the civilization, is estimated to have housed between 30,000 and 60,000 inhabitants at its peak. This is an enormous Bronze Age population. Kor, the great Sumerian city, is estimated at roughly 60,000 people at its height. Hordia, Memphis in Egypt was of comparable scale. These are among the largest cities in the ancient world during this period, and Mohenjo-Daro sits among them as an equal in population, while exceeding most of them in the coherence and sophistication of its civic infrastructure. Harappa, to the northeast, functioned as a comparable population center, an anchor at the other end of the civilization's urban axis, the two great cities balancing each other across the river valleys between them, each supporting a dense residential population housed in a planned urban form. Dozens of smaller towns and hundreds of smaller settlements are distributed across the 1.5 million square kilometer territory between and around them. The citadel mound at Mohenjo-Daro sits approximately 12 meters above the lower city. From its elevation, the grid of the city extends outward in every direction. The main thoroughfares visible as long straight lines between the brick-walled blocks of the residential neighborhoods below. Beyond the city, the floodplain of the Indus extends toward the horizon, flat, agricultural, periodically inundated by the seasonal river flood that deposited the rich sediment in which the city's food supply was grown. The elevated position of the citadel gives whoever stands on it a view of the entire urban landscape, the organized streets, the walls of the residential blocks, the drainage channels at the street margins, the whole contained and deliberate form of a city that was built to a plan and maintained to that plan across generations. The Great Bath occupies the northern portion of the Citadel Mound, adjacent to it, and connected to it by a series of small rooms and passages. It is a large colonnaded building, sometimes labeled as an assembly hall, a structure of considerable floor area, its brick columns arranged in rows across a rectangular space, its purpose as undetermined as the bath's its size suggesting that it was designed to hold groups of people engaged in some organized activity. To the south and west, on the lower areas of the Citadel Mound, are other large structures, platforms, walls, rooms of various sizes that have been labeled variously as granaries, administrative buildings, and ritual spaces by different excavators working at different times with different interpretive frameworks. None of the labels has been confirmed, none has been disproved. The structures exist in their brick solidity and refuse to yield a function from their physical form alone. The small rooms adjacent to the Great Bath are worth pausing in. They are narrow, brick-walled, low-ceilinged by implication. The remains of buildings that once stood to a considerable height are now reduced to their foundations in most cases, the upper stories long since collapsed and compacted into the mounds above them. The walls of the ancillary rooms still stand in sections to a height of several meters, showing the thickness and careful bricklaying of their construction. The gypsum mortar in the joints carries the faint smell of lime that old construction retains in dry conditions. These are small rooms built with as much precision as the bath they served, each brick placed in its correct position, each wall plumb, each floor laid with attention to drainage and level. They were built by people who understood what they were building and cared that it was built correctly. Whatever they were used for, storage, preparation, changing areas for bathers, residences for the people who maintained the bath complex, they were built with the same seriousness as the great tank above which they sat. The civilization that built all of this, the grids, the baths, the standardized bricks, the weight systems, the drainage infrastructure, the wells, the warehouses, the colonnaded halls, stretched across its 1.5 million square kilometers for roughly 7 centuries before its urban system began to wind down. 7 centuries is an extraordinary duration. The United States as a political entity is less than 3 centuries old. The Roman Empire, from the conventional founding to the fall of the Western Empire, spans roughly 5 centuries. The Indus urban civilization ran longer than either of those spans, maintaining its material culture, its brick ratios, its weight systems, its urban planning conventions, its distinctive seal imagery across that duration with a consistency that suggests not a fragile arrangement, prone to disruption, but something deeply embedded in how these communities organize their physical worlds. The consistency raises a question that is quiet but persistent, the kind of question that settles slowly into attention rather than arriving all at once. Something coordinated the brick ratio, something maintained the weight standards. Something sustained the shared vocabulary of urban planning across 1,000 kilometers and 7 centuries. In every other Bronze Age civilization of comparable scale and duration, the answer to that question is visible in the material record: a throne room, a palace, a royal tomb, a carved inscription naming the authority that maintained the order. In Egypt, the pharaoh's name is written on the monuments. In Mesopotamia, the king's deeds are recorded on clay tablets preserved in temple archives. In the Aegean, the linear B tablets of the Mycenaean palaces record the administrative workings of a palace economy with individual rulers at its center. The authority that held those civilizations together left evidence of itself everywhere, in the size of its residences, the scale of its tombs, the inscriptions carved to make its name permanent, the figurative art made to represent its face. That question, what held this civilization together, is not a question this moment needs to answer. The material evidence of the coordination is itself the thing worth sitting with. The brick is in two hands. The ratio is exactly 1 to 2 to 4. 1,000 kilometers away, in the same centuries, another brick was made to the same proportion by people who may never have met the people who made this one, but who followed the same measurement, as though the measurement were simply what a brick was. There is something quiet in that fact, something that resists urgency, the image of two bricklayers at opposite ends of a vast territory, shaping the same object to the same dimensions without knowing each other, connected by a standard that someone somewhere established and communicated and maintained for long enough that it became simply the way things were done. The floodplain of the Indus extends beyond the city's edge in every direction. The river itself shifts over millennia. The channel that served Mohenjo-Daro in 2500 BCE is not the channel that runs through the region today, and the agricultural land that supported the city's tens of thousands of inhabitants was shaped by a hydrological reality that has since changed considerably. But in the centuries of the city's height, the river was close enough to supply the water table from which the city's hundreds of wells drew their water, and the annual flood deposited the sediment that renewed the agricultural fields on which the city's food supply depended. The city was built to a relationship with the river, oriented to its cardinal logic, supplied by its aquifer, protected from its floods by the elevation of its mounds, sustained by the surplus its seasonal rhythms produced. Standing on the Citadel Mound in the late afternoon of a dry season, with the city's grid laid out below and the floodplain extending beyond it toward the horizon, the scale of the enterprise becomes more felt than merely understood. 30,000 people lived below. They lived in houses arranged along streets that ran at right angles. Their wastewater moved through brick-lined drains beneath those streets. They drew water from wells distributed through their neighborhoods. They used weights calibrated to a shared standard when they traded. They fired their bricks to a consistent ratio when they built. They lived in a city that was organized, maintained, and continuously inhabited for centuries, and the person or institution or principle that organized it has left no monument to itself, no inscription of its name, no tomb built to outlast its occupant. The great bath rests on its bitumen-sealed floor in the northern citadel. The descending steps on both ends are still intact, the northern flight and the southern flight meeting at the waterproofed basin between them, the fired brick still holding its courses, the gypsum plaster still present in sections along the interior walls. No water has stood in the basin for roughly 4,000 years. The drainage channel in the western wall still traces the path the water would have taken when the bath was emptied. The construction is precise enough that the purpose is legible even without a single written word to explain it. A tank, steps, water, people descending to the water and ascending again. Whatever it meant to the people who built it, whatever ritual or practical or social function it served in the life of the citadel complex above the city, the bath still holds the shape of an intention, a decision made in approximately 2500 BCE, that a tank of these dimensions, sealed to this standard, built on this elevated ground, was worth the considerable effort required to make it. And then the bricks. It is the bricks that carry the widest frame, the bricks that most quietly insist on the scale of what was here. Not the great bath alone, singular and exceptional, but the individual fired bricks At site after site across a territory larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, each brick shaped in its mold, dried in the sun, fired in the kiln, laid in its wall with its proportions exactly maintained, 1 to 2 to 4. The ratio appears at Mohenjo-Daro in the south, at Harappa to the northeast, at Tolavira in the west of what is now Gujarat, at Kalibangan in Rajasthan, at smaller sites scattered across the vast territory between them. The bricks were not all made by the same hands. They were not all fired in the same kilns. The clay they were made from was local to wherever they were produced, and the variations in color and texture across sites reflect the different soils of different regions, but the ratio held. Across more than 1,000 kilometers, across centuries, across the work of thousands of different hands, shaping thousands of different batches of clay in thousands of different locations, the ratio held. A civilization agreed on the size of its bricks. The agreement was maintained for hundreds of years across a territory most individuals within it may never have crossed in a single lifetime. The people who laid bricks in Dolavira may have known nothing specific about the people who laid bricks in Harappa, may never have traveled that distance, may never have heard of the particular craftsman working in the distant city. But they made the same brick. The measurement was shared. The standard was kept. Whatever mechanism transmitted and maintained that standard, teaching, trading, traveling specialists, shared metrological tools, regional administrative systems, something else entirely, the result is visible in the archaeological record as a quiet, persistent material fact. The brick in two hands, the ratio exact, 1,000 kilometers away, a brick of the same proportion, made in the same centuries, laid in a wall that still partly stands. The fired brick holds the heat of an ancient kiln in the smooth surface of its face. It is heavier than it looks. It fits in two hands with the balanced weight of a well-made object, dense, precise, its corners still sharp after 45 centuries of burial. The ratio is in the dimensions. Length, width, height, in the proportion 1 to 2 to 4, the same measurement that recurs at site after site across the Indus landscape, the same agreement kept across a distance that, in the Bronze Age, was nearly the width of a world. In a display case at the National Museum of Pakistan in Karachi, there is a small carved figure that has been carrying a name it was never given. The figure is made from steatite, a soft, dense stone sometimes called soapstone, and it measures 17.5 centimeters from its base to the top of its carefully incised headband. It was recovered from the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in 1927 by a British excavator named Ernest Mackay, who noted its bearded face, its low-lidded eyes, and the trefoil pattern worked into the surface of its robe. Someone, in the early decades of the excavation, gave it the name Priest King. The name has stayed with it for nearly a century. Not one piece of evidence has ever confirmed it. The figure's expression is composed in the way that stone expressions sometimes are, not serene, not stern, but simply present, the features settled into a surface that does not change. The robe's trefoil pattern, which appears to be filled with red pigment in the original, has been compared to robes worn by Mesopotamian rulers in their own period. The headband crossing the forehead has been compared to the diadems of ancient Near Eastern priests. These comparisons were made by excavators who arrived at the Indus sites already familiar with Egypt and Mesopotamia, who came to the ruins with a set of expectations about what a great civilization should have left behind, and who found, in this small bearded figure, the closest thing the entire excavation ever produced to a king. The label was a guess. It was an informed guess, made by trained archaeologists working in good faith, but it was a guess built on comparison with civilizations that were not the Indus civilization, applied to an object from a culture whose writing has not been read, whose political organization has not been established, and whose relationship to the figure in question cannot be traced to any surviving document or inscription. The figure might represent a priest, it might represent a deity, it might represent a merchant, an ancestor, an idealized human form of entirely unknown social meaning. The record does not say, the record at this point does not say very much at all about who was in charge, and that silence, when measured against everything else the civilization left behind, is one of the most unusual silences in the ancient world. Consider what the excavations at Mohenjo-Daro actually found: a city of fired brick laid out on a near-perfect cardinal grid, its streets running north-south and east-west with the regularity of a ruled line, a citywide drainage network running beneath those streets in brick-lined channels, an estimated 700 or more wells distributed across the residential areas, a large public bath on the elevated western mound, its floors sealed with bitumen, its steps descending from both the north and south ends into a tank built to hold water and hold it well, buildings of multiple stories, residential houses with interior bathing areas connected to the drainage system, a material record of urban organization that has no clear parallel in the ancient world for its period. And in all of that, in every trench, every layer, every structure identified over more than a century of excavation, no throne room, no audience hall, no segregated luxury quarters, no building that the archaeological community has been able to identify with confidence as the private residence of a supreme ruler. This is not a small absence. The ruins of Mohenjo-Daro cover an area estimated at 250 to 300 hectares. The site has been excavated at intervals since the 1920s, with different teams, different methods, and different interpretive frameworks. The elevated western mound, sometimes called the Citadel, holds the Great Bath, a large colonnaded building, variously interpreted as an assembly hall or administrative center, a granary platform, and a number of smaller structures. None of them have yielded a throne. None of them have yielded the carved image or inscribed name of the person who commanded them. The Great Bath itself, one of the most sophisticated hydraulic structures in the ancient world, was built by people who apparently felt no need to inscribe anywhere on its bitumen-sealed walls or its descending brick steps the name of the authority that ordered its construction. Every other major Bronze Age civilization that left comparable physical evidence also left evidence of who was in charge. This is the comparison that makes the Indus silence worth sitting with for a while. At this hour in the dark, contemporaneous Mesopotamia, the civilization of city-states and river valleys that flourished in what is now Iraq during the same centuries that Mohenjo-Daro was at its peak, was not quiet about its rulers. Sargon of Akkad, who built the world's first empire in roughly 2334 BCE, left behind military annals describing his campaigns and inscriptions celebrating the gods who had granted him dominion. Ur-Nammu, who founded the third dynasty of Ur around 2112 BCE and issued one of the earliest known law codes, left building inscriptions, administrative records, and a ziggurat at Ur that still rises above the Iraqi plain today, its every fired brick a monument to the king who ordered it built. The rulers of Ur left behind royal tombs, sealed burial chambers, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, that contained not just the bodies of the kings and queens themselves, but the bodies of their entire retinues. Dozens of courtiers and servants who went into the ground with their sovereigns, surrounded by gold headdresses and silver lyres, and the accumulated portable wealth of a civilization that wanted the world to know exactly who its rulers were. Egypt, in the same period, was building the Old Kingdom pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed for the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, is one of the largest structures ever built by human hands, a monument whose entire purpose was to make the ruler's power and name permanently visible against the sky. The Egyptians built temples, carved reliefs of their pharaohs in battle and ceremony, inscribed their royal names in hieroglyphs that could be read by anyone who passed a monument wall. The royal name in Egyptian belief was essential. To speak the name of the dead was to keep them alive in the afterlife, and the suppression of a ruler's name, as was occasionally carried out against pharaohs who fell from grace, was considered a profound annihilation. The Egyptians understood that a civilization could silence a ruler. They understood it well enough to use it as a punishment. The Indus Civilization, which covered more territory than either of these civilizations at its peak, apparently did neither. It did not announce its rulers. It did not silence them. It left, in place of the entire apparatus of royal self-presentation that its contemporaries deployed with such systematic thoroughness, an absence so consistent that it amounts to its own kind of statement. Though, what that statement says is exactly the question the record declines to answer. The priest-king bust sits in its display case in Karachi, 17.5 centimeters of composed steatite, the trefoil robe, and the headband, and the low-lidded eyes, all exactly as they were when Mackay lifted the figure from the soil of Mohenjo-Daro in 1927. Later scholars, working through the interpretive assumptions that the name imported, have been careful to note what the figure does not confirm. It does not confirm that its subject held political authority. It does not confirm that its subject held religious authority. It does not confirm that the Indus civilization had a category of individual called a priest-king, or that any single figure held the kind of centralized power the label implies. The comparison to Mesopotamian royal imagery, which was the comparison that generated the name in the first place, has been questioned on the grounds that the Indus civilization was not Mesopotamia, that its political organization, whatever it was, should not be assumed to have followed the Mesopotamian template, simply because both civilizations existed in roughly the same historical period. What the figure does confirm is that the Indus people made figurative art of the human face. They were capable of representing a specific individual or a specific type in carved stone. The skill is there, visible in the precision of the trefoil incision and the careful modeling of the beard. The choice not to deploy that skill at monumental scale, not to carve a king in battle on the wall of a public building, not to produce a large-scale image of a sovereign for placement in a temple or a throne room, that choice, if it was a choice, was made by a civilization that clearly knew how to do the thing it apparently chose not to do. There are approximately 30 significant figurines from the entire Indus corpus that are considered to represent human forms. Most of them measure only a few centimeters in height. The largest human figurative sculpture recovered from any Indus site remains in the current record, the Priest King at 17.5 centimeters. This is not a civilization without figuration, but it is a civilization that kept its figuration small, pocket-sized, personal in scale, nothing that could be described as a monument to an individual human authority. The contrast with Mesopotamia, where royal statues several meters tall were installed in temples and public spaces, is not subtle. Set the priest king down for a moment and move to the other end of the material record, to the dead. The burial practices of the Indus civilization have been excavated at several sites, most thoroughly at the R37 cemetery at Harappa, which represents the most carefully documented Indus burial assemblage currently known. The graves at R37 are modest. They are modest in a way that is consistent across the burial population, not identical, because some graves contain slightly more pottery or slightly more personal ornament than others, but consistent in the sense that none of them are doing what royal burials in comparable ancient civilizations do. None of them are enclosed in a sealed stone chamber. None of them contain a burial wagon or a bed or a throne. None of them are surrounded by the bodies of retainers who went into the ground with their master. None of them are marked at the surface by a mound of earth or a stone monument that would distinguish them visually from the graves around them. The most elaborate graves at R37 hold small quantities of pottery, personal ornaments, beads, bangles, sometimes a mirror, and occasional animal offerings. These are objects of personal value, objects that a person might have worn or used in life, and that were placed with them in death. They are not objects of political power. They are not royal regalia. The material record of the R37 cemetery does not permit the identification of any individual buried there as a ruler on funerary evidence alone. The grave goods simply do not reach that register. They reach the register of someone who was loved, or honored, or mourned, but not the register of someone before whom a civilization knelt. This matters because burial practices across many ancient cultures were the primary mechanism by which political authority was made visible in death. The rulers of did not just build monuments in life. They went into the ground with their monuments around them, with their gold and their silver and their courts, making the tomb into a final declaration of hierarchy. The Egyptian pharaoh was buried with the accumulated wealth of a dynasty, in a chamber sealed and inscribed to survive the ages. The burial in these traditions was a last act of self-presentation, one more inscription of the ruler's name and status into the material record. The Indus dead, as far as the excavated evidence shows, went into the ground in quiet. The R37 cemetery at Harappa occupies a low, dry area of the site. In the period when it was in use, the graves would have been dug into the earth by people who knew the dead, who arranged the pottery, placed the ornaments, perhaps spoke something over the earth before they filled it back in. The graves are shallow enough that the surface would have shown little after settling. No mound was raised, no stone was set, no inscription was placed to mark one grave as belonging to someone the civilization considered supreme over the others. The dead of Harappa lie in the dry earth in a register so consistent that the question of who mattered most, if it was a question the civilization recognized, is not one they chose to leave an answer to in the ground. Move from the cemeteries to the administrative buildings to the structures that in other Bronze Age civilizations housed the machinery of royal power. At Mohenjo-Daro, the large building on the Citadel Mound that early excavators labeled a granary has been interpreted variously as a storage facility for centrally collected agricultural surplus, as an assembly hall for civic or religious functions, and as an administrative building of some kind. The platform itself is massive, a raised foundation with ventilation channels running beneath it, capable of supporting a substantial superstructure. It required organized labor to build. It required planning. It required in some form the authority to mobilize the people and materials necessary to construct a large public building in fired brick. That authority has never been identified. The building has never yielded an inscription naming the person or institution that commanded its construction. It has never yielded a carved relief depicting a civic ceremony, a religious rite, or a moment of royal presentation. It has never yielded, in the current record, the sealed deposit or dedicatory inscription that Mesopotamian builders routinely placed in the foundations of their public buildings. Small clay tablets inscribed with the name of the king who ordered the work done and the name of the god in whose honor it was carried out. The Indus builders of this platform did not, as far as the excavated evidence shows, feel the need to write their authority into the physical fabric of the building they were raising, or if they did not do it in any way that has survived or been recognized. This might be, of course, a problem of preservation. The Indus script has not been deciphered, and it is possible that inscriptions recording the names of rulers, the deeds of sovereigns, or the authority behind the great public buildings exist in the seal corpus and have simply not been read. The Stetite seals are small, and their inscriptions are short, an average of 5 signs, too compact for a building dedication or a royal annals, but it is possible the record's silence about royal power is not the same as proof that royal power did not exist. It is a silence in the evidence, and silences in the evidence are gaps, not confirmations. What can be said with more confidence is what was not found. No building at any major Indus site has been identified as a palace. No burial at any Indus site has been identified as a royal tomb. No large-scale figurative sculpture at any Indus site depicts a named or identifiable ruler. No inscription at any Indus site has been read as recording the deeds, the name, or the reign of a king. These are not absences that result from a single missing excavation or a single unread text. They are absences that hold across every major site excavated over the course of more than a century, across Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa and Dholavira and Kalibangan and dozens of smaller settlements, a consistency of non-evidence that is itself, in its quiet way, a kind of evidence. Other civilizations, when their writing was undeciphered or their royal records lost, still left the physical infrastructure of monarchy behind. The palace at Knossos on Crete was recognizable as a palace, as a structure built around concentrated power before a single word of linear A was read, because the building's scale, its complexity, its storage magazines, and its evidence of elite consumption all pointed in the same direction. A palace built for a king looks like a palace, whether or not its inscription has been deciphered. No structure at any Indus site has produced that kind of architectural evidence of a supreme individual authority lodged in a single building, served by a hierarchy of specialized spaces arranged to reflect the needs and the status of a ruler at their center. The priest king sits in its case in Karachi, patient and unreadable. The civilization it was asked to represent, the named ruler who was supposed to stand behind it, the political order whose apex it was supposed to illustrate, is still not there in the record. The figure is real, the label is a supposition, and the distance between the two, across all the decades of excavation and scholarship that have accumulated since Mackay lifted it from the soil, has not meaningfully closed. What is present in the record, in place of the royal apparatus that other civilizations built so thoroughly, is something harder to name, a city organized to a consistent standard across every neighborhood, a drainage system that ran beneath houses in areas identified as lower status residential zones, as well as beneath the buildings on the elevated citadel mound, wells distributed through the city in a pattern that suggests something closer to shared access than to privilege. The consistent brick ratio, 1 to 2 to 4 across length, width, and height, maintained at site after site across more than 1,000 kilometers, repeated in residential walls and in the massive platforms of public buildings alike, the same proportion in a modest house drain and in the walls of the Great Bath. Whatever the organizing principle of this civilization was, it expressed itself in material consistency rather than in material hierarchy. Mohenjo-Daro at its peak held somewhere between 30 and 60,000 people. That is the current estimate, a range wide enough to acknowledge the limits of what can be reconstructed from the physical evidence, but certain enough in both its lower and upper bounds to establish that this was a large city by the standards of the ancient world. A city of that size required coordination. It required decisions about where streets would run, how wide they would be, which direction the drainage gradient would follow. It required agreements about the size of the bricks used in public and private construction alike. It required, at a minimum, something that functioned as authority, some mechanism by which tens of thousands of people organized their shared material environment over decades and centuries. The question the record raises, and does not answer, is what that mechanism looked like. The options that scholars have proposed across the decades of study include a priestly oligarchy centered on the Great Bath and its associated ritual functions, a council of merchants managing the city's economic and administrative functions, a distributed civic authority without a single apex, and, less commonly in recent scholarship, a form of kingship that simply expressed itself through different material channels than the kind of kingship practiced in Mesopotamia or Egypt. None of these proposals has achieved consensus. None of them rest on a deciphered text or an identified throne room or a named ruler. They rest on interpretations of the built environment and the silence within it, on the absence of a palace and the presence of a bath, on the consistency of brick ratios and the modesty of graves. The question is kept open by that silence. It is not closed by it. The absence of royal palaces does not confirm that the Indus civilization was governed by a council. The absence of named rulers does not confirm that no ruler existed. The modest graves at R37 do not confirm that every person buried there was considered equal to every other person. They confirm that whatever differences existed in status or authority among the living were not expressed, in Harappa's burial tradition, through differences in the scale of what was placed in the ground. And these are careful distinctions, and they matter because the honest register here is one of genuine historical uncertainty about a very real and very sophisticated civilization whose political organization has left in the material record a puzzle rather than an answer. The priest king at 17.5 centimeters, the R37 cemetery with its quiet, consistent graves, the citadel mound at Mohenjo-Daro with its great bath and its large unidentified building and its absence of a throne room, the excavated residential blocks of the lower city with their courtyard houses and their bathing slabs and their connections to the drainage network running beneath the streets. All of it is there, documented and measured and cataloged across a century of excavation, and none of it names a king. In Mesopotamia, in the same centuries, the names accumulated in the clay: Sargon of Akkad, Guranamu, Shulgi of Ur, who in his royal hymns compared himself to the gods and recorded the distances of his military campaigns; Gudea of Lagash, who left behind more than 20 carved diorite statues of himself, seated in the posture of a devoted ruler, each one inscribed with his name and his building dedications, each one placed in a temple to ensure that his name remained present before the divine and before posterity. The Mesopotamian kings wrote themselves into the record obsessively, with the particular urgency of people who understood that without inscription, without the name cut into stone, the authority would not persist, that the name and the monument were how a ruler outlasted the life of the body. The Indus civilization produced no equivalent record. The people who built Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa and Oliveira, who maintained a shared brick ratio across more than 1,000 kilometers of ancient landscape, who engineered a citywide drainage system without parallel in the ancient world for its period. Those people, if they had kings, did not write their kings into the material they left behind. And if they did not have kings, they governed a civilization of extraordinary physical scale and organizational complexity through some mechanism that has left no monument to itself and no inscription bearing its name. The steatite bust in Karachi cannot resolve this. It sits in its case with its trefoil robe and its headband and its composed, unreadable expression, carrying the name a British excavator gave it in 1927 because the civilization itself declined to provide one. The question it raises, who was in charge of all this? Who commanded the Great Bath and the grid streets and the consistent brick? And what happened to the record of their authority is a question the figure embodies without answering. Move now to the cemetery at Harappa under a pale sky, the kind of sky that sits above the Punjab plain in the dry season, the light broad and even, no cloud to interrupt it. The R37 cemetery occupies its low ground outside the settlement's residential area, the graves arranged in the earth in rows that the excavators uncovered carefully, recording each pit and each assemblage before lifting anything from the soil. Pottery beside the dead, modest and whole, beads and bangles, personal things, the occasional animal offering, nothing raised above the surface, nothing inscribed, grave after grave at the same quiet register, the same scale, the same material language, the language of people who were known to those who buried them and who went into the ground with the objects of their personal lives rather than the symbols of their public authority. No grave in the R37 cemetery rises higher than the others. No grave is enclosed in a stone chamber that separates its occupant from the earth. No inscription stands above any burial to say what this person commanded, what territory they ruled, what God spoke through them, what made them more important than the person in the adjacent pit. The dead of an entire civilization lie in this dry ground in the same register as one another, as though the question of who was most important, a question their contemporaries in Mesopotamia and Egypt answered with gold burial chambers and inscribed stone monuments, and the bodies of entire courts sent into the ground alongside their sovereign, was never one they chose to answer in this way. In this place, in the earth where their people came at last to rest, the sky above the R37 cemetery is the same sky it has always been. The graves are shallow, well below the present surface now, the soil that was replaced above them long since settled. The pottery is in museum storage, catalogued and measured. The bones have been analyzed by physical anthropologists who have reconstructed what they can of diet, disease, and age at death from the material the earth returned. Nothing in that analysis identified a king, nothing in the bone record, nothing in the pottery record, nothing in the accumulation of personal ornament placed beside the dead of Harappa over the centuries of that cemetery's use. Nothing reaches up toward the register of royal authority, the register that Mesopotamia and Egypt achieved so thoroughly and so permanently in the same broad centuries. The dead of Harappa chose, or were arranged, to go into the ground in quiet equality of scale, and the record they left is a record of that quiet, holding its shape in the dry soil 4,000 years after the last grave was filled. In a museum archive, held at the edge of a gloved hand under low light, a small square object rests with the particular stillness of something that has not moved in a very long time. It is made of steatite, a soft, pale stone, smooth to the touch from firing, cool even under a lamp. The face of it carries an incised figure, an animal with a single horn curving forward from its brow, its body in profile, its legs planted as though pausing mid-step. Above the animal, in a short row along the upper edge, 4 or 5 signs are arranged in a sequence that has not been read since the hand that pressed this seal into wet clay withdrew from it sometime around 2300 BCE. The object weighs almost nothing. It is smaller than a matchbox, and it carries, in those few incised marks, a message that the civilization that produced it understood completely, and that no one alive has ever been able to read. The Indus Valley Civilization left behind approximately 4,000 to 4,500 inscribed objects of this kind. Most of them are seals, small, square, or rectangular, carved from steatite and fired to harden the surface, each one bearing a short inscription above an animal figure or geometric design. Some are flat tablets. Some are copper tools with signs incised along their length. A few are pottery vessels marked before firing with a single sign or a pair of them. The corpus is not small by the standards of early writing systems, but it has a particular quality that has made it extraordinarily resistant to analysis. The inscriptions are almost uniformly brief. The average inscription runs to 5 signs. The longest known inscription contains only about 26 signs, arranged across the faces of a single object. There are no long texts. There are no extended narratives. There is nothing that resembles a sentence in the way most early decipherments rely on: a verb, a subject, a sequence of meaning long enough to triangulate the values of individual signs. Researchers working on the script have identified somewhere between 400 and 500 distinct sign forms within the corpus. That number matters. A system with fewer than 30 or so signs is likely an alphabet, where individual marks represent individual sounds. A system with several hundred signs is more likely logographic or syllabic, where signs represent words or syllables rather than single phonemes. The Indus script sign count places it in the range of syllabic systems like Linear B or early Sumerian cuneiform, but the brevity of its inscriptions has prevented any of the structural foothold that allowed those systems to be cracked. Linear B was deciphered in part because Michael Ventris could work with inscriptions long enough to identify repeated sign clusters, grammatical endings, and patterns consistent with known Greek morphology. The Indus corpus offers nothing of comparable length. 5 signs, 4 signs, 3 signs, and then silence. Every serious attempt at decipherment over the past 100 years has arrived, eventually, at the same boundary. Scholars have proposed that the script encodes an early Dravidian language, that it encodes a Proto-Indo-European language, that it encodes a language ancestral to Sanskrit, that it represents a system whose spoken root is entirely unknown. None of these proposals has achieved anything approaching consensus. The mainstream of current scholarship holds that the script encodes spoken language of some kind, that it is a genuine writing system, not a simple tallying notation, but agreement ends there. The signs above the unicorn-like animal on that museum seal carry a meaning as complete and as specific as any words written in any language, and every scholar who has studied them has had to sit, eventually, with the fact that the meaning is simply not available. It has not been lost in the sense of being destroyed. It is present in those marks. It is just entirely inaccessible from where we stand. It helps to know what these objects were for, or at least what one part of their function seems to have been. The stamp seals, the most common inscribed Indus objects, were almost certainly used as administrative tools in the movement of traded goods. When a bundle of cloth or a jar of sesame oil was prepared for transport, A lump of wet clay would be pressed over the cord binding it, and the seal would be pushed into the clay, leaving an impression that identified the goods, their origin, their owner, their quantity, or some combination of these, in a form that could be checked at the receiving end. Archaeologists have recovered clay ceilings with Indus impressions still intact, lumps of dried clay bearing the clear negative image of a seal pressed into them, the cord impressions sometimes still visible on the reverse, the goods they once secured long since gone. These clay ceilings are what make the seals legible as commercial instruments. They were used, pressed, checked, and filed. The signs above the animal figure were not decorative. They meant something specific, and they were understood by whoever opened those bundles. The evidence that these sealed goods traveled very far has been found at a considerable distance from the Indus cities themselves. Indus-type stamp seals, objects physically made from carved steatite in the Indus style, bearing Indus signs above Indus animal figures, have been recovered from Mesopotamian archaeological sites at Ura, at Lagash, at Tel Abraq, in soil layers dated to roughly the same centuries the Indus cities were at their height. These small square objects have been found lying in the same strata as Mesopotamian cylinder seals, Mesopotamian administrative records, and the material debris of Mesopotamian commercial life. The conclusion is straightforward. Indus traders, or goods that originated in Indus cities, reached the urban centers of Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BCE. The seals may have traveled with the traders themselves. They may have been pressed into clay at Indus ports and arrived in Mesopotamia, still attached to their bundles. Either way, these objects moved across several thousand kilometers of the ancient world, carrying inscriptions that the Mesopotamians who received them could probably not read, and that administrators in Ur may have processed and filed without ever knowing what language the signs encoded. What this means for the question of the script is interesting in a quiet way. The Indus signs were not private marks, not household symbols scratched onto pottery by a single family and never shared beyond the village level. They were formal, standardized, widely reproduced, and clearly understood by the people who used them across a civilization covering more than 1 million square kilometers. The same sign forms appear at Mohenjo-Daro and at Dhalavira and at Harappa, sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, with a consistency that confirms the script belonged to the whole civilization, not to a single city or regional tradition. Whatever those signs encoded, it was shared. The system was alive and functional, and apparently well understood by a large population over a period of several hundred years. And then it stopped. The inscribed ceilings, the stamped pottery, the carved steatite seals, these objects become rarer as the Indus urban period winds down, and they disappear from the archaeological record as the cities decline. No successor script emerged. No later South Asian writing system shows a demonstrable connection to Indus signs. The Brahmi script, the earliest writing system identified in the Indian subcontinent after the Indus period, appears in the archaeological record many centuries later and shows no clear structural continuity with the Indus script sign forms or organizational principles. The writing simply ended. Whatever it encoded went with it, not into hiding, not into a transformed system, but into a silence that is held for roughly 4,000 years. The computational approach to the script has offered some of the most careful recent analysis of what it might be. In 2004, Rajesh Rao and a team of colleagues conducted a statistical study of the Indus sign corpus, examining the way signs cluster and follow each other within inscriptions. They measured what is called the conditional entropy of the sign sequences, a statistical property that reflects how predictable each successive sign is given what came before it. A truly random sequence of symbols has very high conditional entropy because the next symbol is entirely unpredictable. A rigidly rule-bound system, like the DNA code, where the same triplets always encode the same amino acids, has very low conditional entropy because the next element is nearly determined by what preceded it. Natural spoken languages fall in a particular middle range because human language is neither random nor fully predictable. It is shaped by grammar and vocabulary, but flexible enough to generate almost unlimited new combinations. The Rao study, published in the journal Science, found that the Indus script sign sequences fall in the same statistical range as known natural languages, including English, Sanskrit, and Sumerian. The signs do not follow each other randomly. They do not follow each other with the rigid predictability of a purely non-linguistic code. They behave, statistically, the way the signs of a writing system encoding spoken language would be expected to behave. The paper was careful in its conclusions. The authors stated explicitly that their analysis did not constitute a decipherment. It did not reveal what any sign means. It did not identify the language the script might encode. What it established was a statistical property. The Indus sign corpus has the internal structure of a language encoding system, and not the structure of a non-linguistic symbol, set such as heraldic marks, clan emblems, or simple counting tallies. That finding placed the Indus script more firmly in the category of writing and pushed it further from the category of notation, but the signs themselves remained exactly as silent as they had always been. The dissenting view, the argument that the Indus script may not encode spoken language at all, was put forward in the same year by Steve Farmer, Richard Sproat, and Michael Witzel. Their paper argued that the brevity of Indus inscriptions, the relatively large number of distinct sign forms, and the absence of any long texts made it more plausible that the Indus signs were a system of non-linguistic symbols, religious or ritual markers, clan identifiers, administrative categories that did not correspond to phonetic values in any spoken tongue. They compared the Indus corpus to other non-linguistic symbol systems from the ancient world and argued that the statistical patterns cited by Rao and colleagues did not uniquely identify linguistic encoding and could be produced by other kinds of structured symbol use. The Farmer-Sproat-Witzel position was not widely adopted by the mainstream archaeological community, and the Rao study's findings have been the more influential contribution to subsequent scholarship. But the dissenting view has never been definitively closed. It remains in the literature as a live minority position, not confirmed, not refuted, simply occupying a space in the ongoing conversation that no one has yet been able to seal. The Dolavira signboard exists at a different scale than anything else in the Indus script corpus. Most Indus inscriptions are intimate objects, things held in a hand, pressed into clay, worn perhaps as pendants or carried in a pocket. The signboard was nothing of the kind. During excavations at Talavera in the 1990s, led by the archaeologist R.S. Besht, a remarkable discovery emerged near the northern gateway of the ancient city. In the soil where the gateway's inner chamber had once stood, the excavators found fragments of white gypsum mineral, inlay pieces that had originally been set into a backing of some organic material, almost certainly wood, to form a large composite panel. The wood had long since decayed in the dry earth of the Rann of Kutch, but the gypsum pieces retained something of their original arrangement. Careful reconstruction of the fragments suggested that the panel had originally been approximately 3 meters wide. On it, in large white gypsum signs, set against the darker wood behind them, 10 Indus signs had been displayed, each one large enough to be read from a distance, mounted in a position at the city gateway, where anyone entering or leaving Dolavira would have passed beneath or before it. There is nothing else like it in the entire Indus corpus. Every other known Indus inscription was made to be held, carried, or pressed. The Dolavira signboard was made to be seen from across a public space. It was a civic inscription, something displayed to the population of an entire city, or to arriving visitors, or to traders passing through the gate. Its scale implies intention. The signs were not meant for a single reader leaning close, but for a crowd, or at least for anyone approaching the northern entrance to one of the Indus civilization's major cities. The 10 signs are among the largest Indus sign forms ever recovered. Their meaning is entirely unknown. The inscription raises questions that have no current answers. Was it a name, the name of the city, or the name of a ruler, or the name of a deity associated with the gateway? Was it a declaration of some kind, an administrative notice, a ritual formula, a boundary marker? Was it permanent, or was it replaced periodically with new signs as circumstances changed? The gypsum inlay technique suggests considerable care in fabrication. Someone cut the mineral into the shapes of the signs, set them into a prepared wooden backing, and mounted the result in a prominent position where it would remain visible as long as the wood held together. That is not the work of a casual notation. It implies that the people of Dolavira considered this inscription worth the effort of making it legible to many across open air at the threshold of their city. What it said to them, clearly, specifically, in the shared language of the Indus script, is the one thing that the physical evidence cannot provide. Consider what it would have meant to stand at that gateway in 2200 BCE and understand the signboard above. The 10 signs would have resolved instantly into meaning, the way a road sign or a shop front resolves for anyone who reads the language in which it is written, without effort, without conscious decoding, simply as information received. A trader arriving with goods, a farmer entering the city for a market day, a craftsman who had lived within those walls for 30 years, any of them would have glanced up and known what the sign said. The inscription would have been as ordinary and as legible as any other part of the built environment. And that complete familiarity, that shared unremarkable comprehension, is precisely what the passage of 4,000 years has made unreachable. The signs are still there, in their fragmentary gypsum forms. The knowledge that made them obvious is simply gone from the world. What survives of the script is, in its way, a remarkably coherent body of evidence. The seals are well-made objects fired hard, incised with precision, durable enough to outlast the buildings they were stored in and the goods they were used to seal. The clay impressions are more fragile, but a substantial number have survived. The sign forms across the thousands of inscribed objects in the corpus are consistent enough that researchers working in different decades and from different theoretical positions have largely agreed on which marks constitute distinct signs and which are variants of the same sign. The corpus is real, documented, cataloged, and accessible. Major collections of Indus inscribed objects are held at the National Museum of Pakistan in Karachi, at the National Museum in New Delhi, at the Archaeological Survey of India, and at various institutional archives and university collections around the world. The seals can be studied. The signs can be counted, measured, and subjected to statistical analysis. Every possible structural approach to decipherment has been tried, many of them with rigor and care. The limitation is not one of access to the material. It is something more fundamental. Every writing system that has been successfully deciphered was cracked through some combination of three things: a bilingual or multilingual text that gave the same content in a known and an unknown language, sufficient length in the unknown inscriptions to work with grammatical patterns, or a known linguistic ancestor or descendant that gave approximate guidance to the sounds and structure of the unknown system. The Rosetta Stone gave Egyptian hieroglyphics the first of these. Linear B gave Michael Ventris the second, and a reasonable guess about the third. The Indus script has none of them. There is no Indus Rosetta Stone, no object inscribed in both Indus signs, and a known ancient language. The inscriptions are too short to yield grammatical analysis, and the language, if it is a language, has no confirmed descendant or ancestor in any known linguistic family. The script does not sit in isolation from scholarship. It sits in isolation from the specific kinds of evidence that have allowed every other ancient writing system to eventually yield its sounds and meanings. That isolation is not a failure of effort. It is not a gap that has persisted through neglect. Serious scholars have worked on the Indus script for more than a century, since the first systematic excavations at Harappa in the 1920s brought the inscribed seals into the archaeological record in significant numbers for the first time. The computational work of the early 2000s applied the most rigorous quantitative methods then available. More recent machine learning approaches have been brought to bear on the corpus, examining sign distributions and sequence patterns with tools that would have been unavailable to earlier generations of researchers. The script has not lacked attention. It has simply declined, consistently and without apparent explanation, to become readable through any method yet applied. A steatite seal from one of the Mohenjo-Daro excavations rests now in a museum case in Karachi, labeled with its site number, its excavation context, its dimensions, and the brief note that its inscription remains undeciphered. The label is accurate. The inscription runs to 5 signs above the figure of a unicorn-like animal standing before a ritual object, a manger or incense stand, scholars have suggested, though the interpretation of that object too remains uncertain. The seal was made by a craftsman who probably produced dozens like it, working within a standardized set of conventions so well established that an identical sign sequence might appear on another seal recovered from Harappa, 800 kilometers to the northeast. The two craftsmen may never have met. The signs they used were the same. The animal figure on Indus seals deserves a moment of attention because it is the most repeated image in the entire Indus corpus, and its identity is itself a source of ongoing discussion. The creature appears on more Indus seals than any other animal, a bovine body with a single curving horn projecting from its brow, its neck slightly arched, its body in profile as it stands before the ritual object. Early excavators and subsequent scholars often called it a unicorn, acknowledging that the depiction is technically a unicorn in the most literal sense, a one-horned animal. Others have proposed it as a one-horned rhinoceros in stylized form, or as a deliberately invented mythological animal with no real-world referent, or as a conventional two-horned bull rendered in profile so that only one horn is visible, a representational convention documented in other ancient artistic traditions. The question remains open. The most common image in the Indus visual record, reproduced thousands of times across centuries of production, is an animal whose identity scholars have not agreed upon. It stands before an object they cannot identify, beneath an inscription they cannot read. It would be easy to let this accumulation of unresolved questions feel like an obstacle, like something standing between the present and a full understanding of the Indus civilization that is simply a matter of enough time and enough work. But the current state of Indus script scholarship suggests something slightly different. The obstacles are real and structural, not merely a matter of insufficient effort. The bilingual inscription that would change everything may not exist. The linguistic ancestor that would give phonetic values to the signs may not be identifiable. The long text that would allow grammatical analysis may never have been written. If the Indus scribal tradition simply did not produce long texts in durable media, then no amount of excavation will bring them to light. The corpus that exists may be, effectively, the complete corpus, and if that is the case, the Indus script may remain in its current state, structurally identifiable as a writing system, statistically consistent with language encoding, physically present in thousands of carefully made objects, and semantically closed, not forever necessarily, but for the foreseeable future of the scholarship. What has been confirmed through physical evidence rather than interpretation is that this writing system was widely shared, formally maintained, and important enough to a complex civilization that it traveled with goods across several thousand kilometers of the ancient world, was displayed in large format at city gateways, and was reproduced with remarkable consistency across the full geographic range of the civilization. The signs were not marginal, they were central. They appeared on the objects that moved commodities. They marked the entrances to cities. They were incised by skilled craftsmen using consistent techniques in cities separated by distances. Their creators may never have personally crossed. A clay ceiling recovered from a warehouse context in one of the Indus cities bears the impression of a seal pressed into it, while the clay was still wet. The impression is clear. The animal figure in the center of the flat face, the short row of signs above it. The cord that bound the bundle is gone. The bundle itself is gone. The warehouse is gone, its bricks scattered or eroded over 4 millennia. The clay lump, dried hard by the same sun that baked everything else in the Rann of Kutch and the Indus Plain, survived simply by being clay, by being the kind of thing that heat preserves rather than destroys. The signs pressed into it are in the same sequence they were in when a hand closed the seal onto the wet surface and pressed. The message is intact. The message is simply not readable. In the trading quarter at Ur, in a soil layer dated to the same centuries the Indus cities were at their height, an Indus-type seal was found lying among Mesopotamian cylinder seals. Both kinds of objects were administrative instruments, both used to identify ownership and secure goods in transit. The Mesopotamian cylinder seals pressed their designs into clay by rolling, producing long narrative images of gods and kings and mythological scenes. The Indus stamp seal pressed its flat face once, leaving a small square impression of an animal and a row of signs. These two writing systems, from two of the great urban civilizations of the 3rd millennium BCE, lay in the same soil in the same archive room in ancient Arbar. One of them is legible. The cuneiform Mesopotamian system has been read for well over a century, its grammar analyzed, its vocabulary cataloged, its literature translated and published. The other seal, its signs above its unicorn-like animal, remains exactly as it was when it traveled from the Indus cities to the Persian Gulf trading networks and arrived in Mesopotamia in the hands or the cargo of an Indus trader, whose name no one will ever know. The specific sign forms on that seal. The shapes, the order, the particular combination that appeared on that object's face were meaningful to the person who owned the seal and to the people in the Indus cities who recognized the inscription and understood what it designated. To the Mesopotamians who received the goods it sealed, the signs may have been opaque, a foreign script from a trading partner whose language was not their own, meaningful in the commercial context even without being linguistically legible, the way a Chinese customs seal might be meaningful to a European importer today without the importer reading a word of Chinese. Or the Mesopotamians may have had translators, intermediaries, people who could read both systems. That possibility too remains open. The evidence does not say. There is something quietly absorbing about the specific materiality of the steatite seal as an object. Steatite soapstone is a soft mineral in its natural state, carvable with simple metal tools, fine-grained enough to hold the precise edges of small inscribed signs without crumbling. After carving, the seals were fired at high temperature, a process that hardened the steatite significantly and often produced a white or cream-colored surface glaze. The result was an object that began soft and became hard, that was shaped while it could be shaped, and then fixed permanently in that form. The signs incised before firing could not be altered afterward without destroying the seal. The message, once committed, was committed. The seal would carry those signs for as long as the fired steatite held together, which has turned out to be approximately 4,000 years. Most seals have a small perforated boss on the back, a raised tab of steatite with a hole drilled through it, through which a cord could be passed. This allowed the seal to be worn, carried, or hung. Some scholars have suggested that seals were personal property, that the inscription identified not a commodity, but an individual, the way a signet ring or a notarial stamp identifies a specific authority. If that is correct, then the signs above the unicorn-like animal may include something like a name or a title or a clan affiliation, something that specified a particular person in the Indus administrative or commercial world, clearly enough that anyone who knew the system could identify the seal's owner at a glance. That remains one possibility among several. The signs might encode a commodity type, a quantity, a trade route, a deity's name associated with the goods, or some combination of these. The compact size of the average inscription, 4 or 5 signs, is consistent with any of these functions. 5 signs is enough to write a name. It is also enough to write a quantity and a category. It is not enough to definitively establish which of these the inscription is doing. This is, in the end, the particular texture of the Indus script as a historical problem. It is not that the evidence is absent. The evidence is abundant, well preserved, distributed across multiple continents, and studied with serious tools. It is that the evidence is consistently just short of what decipherment requires, short in inscription length, short in contextual information, short in the linguistic anchors that would allow the sounds behind the signs to be recovered. The script holds its meaning the way a photograph holds the face of someone whose name you have never known, completely, clearly, with all the information present, and the meaning simply does not pass across the boundary between its world and this one. The 10 gypsum signs of the Dolavira signboard rest now in the dry earth of the Ran of Kutch, preserved by the same aridity that preserved the fired bricks of the city's walls and the carved steatite of its seals. The wood that backed them is gone, dissolved into the soil over the course of 4,000 years. The signs themselves, white mineral fragments still holding their carved shapes in the ground where the gateway once stood, are still physically present, still arranged in something like their original positions, still legible as signs, even if their meaning is not legible as language. They were mounted once in a prominent and carefully chosen position at the entrance to a city of tens of thousands. They were large enough to read from across an open plaza. They were made to last, or at least to last as long as the wood that supported them. which turned out to be long enough for the gypsum to outlive everything else in that gateway chamber. The people who made those signs, and the people who read them without effort when they passed through that gate on an ordinary morning 4,000 years ago, understood something that has not been transmitted, not hidden, not locked away deliberately, not erased with intention, simply not carried forward into any tradition from which it might be recovered. The language moved on, or changed, or contracted with the civilization that housed it, and the signs that encoded it became the kind of object that archaeologists find, and catalog, and study, and carefully cannot read. They are present, they are patient. They have been waiting in the same silence since the city stopped being a city, since the traders stopped moving through the gate, since the last hand that pressed those signs into clay set the seal down, and the clay dried, and the meaning became something only the seal's maker would have been able to offer, and then even that person was gone, and the clay and the steatite remained, carrying their message intact into a silence that has held, without urgency and without resolution, for a very long time. A brick-lined drain runs beneath a Mohenjo-Daro street. Wet, the capstone sits flush with the paved surface above it, removable, set with enough care that it could be lifted by a single worker for cleaning, then replaced without a gap. The channel beneath is shallow and rectangular, its walls made from the same fired brick used for the houses on either side, and the floor slopes, only slightly but consistently, toward the outer edge of the city, carrying whatever moved through it, downhill and away. This drain was built sometime around 2400 BCE. It was designed to be maintained. The people who built it expected it to need maintenance, and they built the access in from the start. That expectation is itself a kind of quiet fact. A drain with a removable capstone is not a drain built for a single generation. It is a drain built for a city that intended to go on being a city, a piece of infrastructure conceived with the assumption that there would always be someone to lift the stone, check the channel, clear whatever had settled, and replace the cover before the next cart came through. The street above it continued in both directions, running north and south along the grid, wide enough for wheel traffic, the drain following the center line of the road, or running along its margin, part of a system that extended through every residential quarter of the city. Beneath the main thoroughfares and the smaller side lanes, both Mohenjo-Daro's drainage network was not a single main sewer serving a privileged core. The channels ran beneath the streets of residential neighborhoods across the lower city, connecting individual houses to the larger collector drains at the urban perimeter. Each house had its own waste outlet, a small opening through the exterior wall at ground level, or a covered chute descending from an upper floor, feeding into the street channel outside. The system was citywide. It extended through areas that archaeologists have identified as ordinary residential zones, neighborhoods where the houses were modest in size and the finds were practical rather than luxurious. The drain did not discriminate by district. This is unusual. It is unusual enough that the word unusual does not quite carry the right weight. In the same centuries that Mohenjo-Daro was laying covered drains beneath its residential streets, the great cities of Mesopotamia had no comparable system. Egyptian workers' villages had none. The drainage infrastructure of the ancient world, in most places where it existed at all, served palaces, temples, or elite compounds, the buildings of those for whom the resources of a city could be organized and spent. At Mohenjo-Daro, the drains served the houses of people who appear, on the material evidence alone, to have been ordinary residents of a very large and very carefully organized city, and the channels beneath their streets were built with the same precision as everything else. The wells tell a similar story. Mohenjo-daro contained an estimated 700 or more wells distributed across its residential neighborhoods, and the number alone is worth resting in for a moment. 700. The city covered an area of perhaps 250 to 300 hectares, and within that space, the builders placed wells at intervals close enough that no resident would need to travel far to reach one. The wells were not clustered near the elevated citadel mound, not concentrated in a zone of larger houses or more elaborate architecture. The distribution extended through the lower city, into the neighborhoods of modest courtyard houses and narrow lanes, into the areas where the archaeology does not suggest exceptional wealth or status. Each well shaft was constructed using a particular technique that has no casual explanation. The bricks were tapered, slightly wedge-shaped rather than fully rectangular, so that when they were laid in a ring, the angle of each brick combined with the angles of all the others to form a stable cylinder without mortar. The shaft could descend to the water table, sometimes more than 10 meters, holding its shape through the pressure of surrounding soil. Through decades and centuries of use, without the mortar that held the rest of the city's construction together. This required calculation. It required an understanding of the forces acting on a cylindrical wall underground and a decision about how to answer those forces with the shape of the individual brick. The people who designed these wells were solving a structural problem, and the solution they arrived at was geometrically elegant. A well shaft of this kind in an ordinary residential neighborhood in a city that may have housed between 30 and 60,000 people at its peak represents a particular kind of investment. The labor to dig to the water table, the skill to shape and fire tapered bricks to a consistent angle, the engineering to stack them without mortar and have the shaft hold. All of this, repeated 700 times across the urban area, suggests that clean water in reach of ordinary households was understood as something the city owed to those who lived in it. Whether that understanding was a conscious civic philosophy or simply a practical inheritance from generations of builders who knew what a city required to function is not a question the archaeology can answer. What it shows is the outcome, the wells, the distribution, the care, and leaves the question of motivation as the gap it has always been. Within the houses themselves, the physical attention to sanitation continues at a domestic scale that still feels considered across 4,000 years of distance. A typical ground floor residence in Mohenjo-daro included a dedicated bathing area, a flat platform of carefully laid brick with a slight slope toward a small drain hole in the corner. The slope was deliberate. Water moved down it and through the hole and into the channel in the wall, and from the channel into the street drain outside, following a path the builders had cleared for it. The bathing platform was just large enough for one person. The bricks of the floor were smooth from controlled kiln heat, their surfaces impermeable enough to shed water rather than absorb it, the joints between them tight enough to prevent pooling. Some houses at Mohenjo-daro have yielded evidence of facilities that serve the function of latrines, raised seats with openings above brick-lined shafts or channels, the waste routed into the external drainage system by the same network that handled bath water and street runoff. In buildings that appear to have had more than one story, there are traces of vertical chutes descending through the wall from upper floors to street-level drains, so that even residents living above the ground did not need to carry waste to the street by hand. The chutes descended through the wall quietly, inside the brick, part of the building's structure rather than an afterthought attached to its exterior. A city that thought about where water went when it fell, and where it went before and after, and how it would move from the inside of a house to the outside of a city without requiring anyone to carry it. The courtyard plan of Mohenjo-Daro's residential houses appears with remarkable consistency across the excavated areas of the lower city. A central open courtyard, typically unroofed or lightly roofed, surrounded by rooms on at least 3 sides. The courtyard caught light, circulated air, and in a hot and seasonally dry climate served as the practical center of domestic life, a space for cooking, for craft work, for sitting in the cooler hours of early morning and late afternoon. The rooms surrounding it were modest in their proportions. The bathing area was usually off to one side. The ground floor often contained a staircase ascending to upper levels, though the upper floors themselves have not survived in any complete form at any Indus site excavated to date. What the archaeologists have found when comparing houses across different neighborhoods of Mohenjo-Daro is a pattern of similarity that has no obvious counterpart in the contemporaneous ancient world. The houses differ in size. Some are larger, some smaller, some have more rooms, some have fewer, but the differences are modest in degree compared to the stark contrasts between elite and ordinary housing in cities of the same period in Egypt or Mesopotamia. At Urgi, in the same centuries, the palace complex and the houses of wealthy merchants occupied an architectural register entirely separate from the dwellings of ordinary urban residents. At Memphis, the hierarchy of domestic space followed the hierarchy of social position closely enough that the size of a house was a legible expression of the power of its occupant. At Mohenjo-Daro, the material record suggests something different, a domestic landscape in which the largest houses were larger than the smallest houses, but in which the underlying spatial logic, the courtyard plan, the brick construction, the connection to the drainage network, was shared across the full range of residential architecture. This is the point at which the honest scholarship introduces its hesitations, and those hesitations are worth sitting with, rather than smoothing over. A physical similarity in house plan does not automatically translate into a social equality in lived experience. An architectural tradition can produce uniform courtyard houses in a city with profound social stratification if the courtyard plan is simply what the available materials, the local climate, and the prevailing building convention together require. The similarity of Mohenjo-Daro's residential architecture may reflect a broad civic equality in the distribution of urban goods, or it may reflect a deep tradition of building in a particular way that was applied across social ranks without that application implying anything specific about who held power and who did not. The archaeology cannot fully separate these possibilities. What it can do is note that the drainage network served the whole city, that the wells were distributed across the whole city, that the bathing areas and waste facilities appear in houses of varying sizes across the whole city, and that the material finds from residential areas, the pottery, the small tools, the personal ornaments, the weights, do not cluster in patterns that clearly identify a residential zone of concentrated wealth separated by a visible gap from zones of concentrated poverty. The pattern is there. What it means is where the record goes quiet. There is a large brick platform at Harappa that spent several decades in the academic literature as a centralized granary. The early excavators, working in the 1920s through the 1940s, identified it as a storage facility of sufficient scale to suggest an administrative authority capable of collecting agricultural surplus from surrounding areas and redistributing it through the city, a model of urban economy familiar from Mesopotamian and Egyptian analogy. The platform, raised and massive, with channels running beneath it for air circulation, seemed to fit the shape of a controlled, managed food supply. the kind of economic infrastructure that implies a central administrator, a redistribution system, and by implication, an authority powerful enough to organize it. More recent scholars have examined the Harappa granary platform with greater skepticism about that identification. No carbonized grain has been recovered from the structures. No definitive evidence of storage in the form expected for a large-scale food depot has been found in the excavated areas. The air channels beneath the platform, once interpreted as a practical measure to prevent moisture from damaging stored grain, have alternative explanations: ritual function, structural reinforcement, drainage, that cannot be ruled out on the physical evidence alone. The label of granary, useful as a working hypothesis for several generations of researchers, has become a genuine interpretive question rather than a settled identification. This matters because what the platform means shapes what the city means. A centralized granary implies a centralized authority capable of commanding its construction and managing its contents, a kind of institutional power that would be consistent with a ruling class, an administrative elite, a hierarchical organization of the urban economy. A large platform whose function is genuinely undetermined leaves open a wider range of possibilities for how Harappa's resources were organized and who, if anyone, held decisive authority over them. The uncertainty is not a failure of the archaeology. It is an honest account of what the material record contains and what it does not. The same honest uncertainty runs through the interpretation of other large structures at Mohenjo-Daro, the building that archaeologists have called, in various decades, a granary, an assembly hall, and an administrative center, stands on the elevated citadel mound, its brick foundations still visible, its superstructure long since gone. It is the largest identified building at the site. It has been interpreted as evidence of centralized storage, of civic assembly, of ritual function, and of administrative control, often by different scholars working on the same physical remains. No inscription identifies the building's purpose. No dedicatory text names an authority that commissioned it. The building stands, or rather its foundations stand, as the largest architectural fact in the city, and what it was for remains, in the precise language of the scholarship, a matter of active discussion. The Great Bath sits on the same elevated mound, and its function is equally a matter of inference rather than documentation. The rectangular tank, sealed with bitumen to hold water, equipped with descending steps on both the north and south ends, and surrounded by smaller rooms and corridors, was probably used for ritual or ceremonial bathing. That is the interpretive consensus, or something close to it. But the nature of the ceremony, who performed it and who watched it, who maintained the water and who controlled access to the tank, none of this appears in any record the civilization left behind. The Great Bath is a statement of extraordinary technical and civic intention. What it intended has to be approached through analogy with other ancient cultures, through the physical detail of the structure itself, and through careful inference. And inference, however well supported, is not documentation. What the Indus cities left behind is a record of sustained, city-scale investment in the conditions of daily life: clean water within reach of ordinary residents, wastewater carried away from houses through a maintained system of covered channels, bathing areas built into the ground floors of ordinary houses, the physical conditions of domestic health, the movement of waste away from living spaces, the provision of clean water for drinking and washing, treated as problems worth solving at an infrastructure level, rather than left to individual households to manage as best they could. This is an unusual set of priorities to read in the physical record of a Bronze Age city. It is not the set of priorities that the great architectural monuments of other ancient civilizations suggest their builders held most urgently. The pyramids at Giza are statements about the endurance of royal power, built to survive the death of specific named individuals and to declare in stone that their significance outlasted their lifetimes. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia are statements about divine authority, built to provide a physical home for the city's patron deity and to demonstrate the wealth and organizational capacity of the political authority that raised them. These are structures whose purpose is legible in their scale and their placement. They declare something, they assert something, they are built to be seen and understood as statements of hierarchical power. Mohenjo-Daro's largest structures do not clearly declare anything of this kind. The Great Bath may have served ritual purposes, but it does not bear the name of the person who commanded it. The elevated platform that may or may not have been a granary does not carry an inscription attributing it to a ruler or a dynasty. The wide streets and covered drains and distributed wells do not announce the name of the administrator who designed them. Whatever authority organized these cities, and something organized them, because they were built at a scale and with a consistency that requires planning and coordination, did not, on the material evidence, choose to mark that authority in the physical fabric of the city with its own name or image. This is the pattern that runs beneath the domestic detail, the courtyard houses, and the bathing slabs, and the drain channels, and the tapered brick wells, like the drainage system itself, present at every level, shaping the shape of everything above it, entirely invisible until excavation reaches it. The infrastructure was built for everyone. The monuments that would have told the world who built the infrastructure were apparently either never made or have not survived in any form the archaeology has recovered. And between those two possibilities, never made or not yet found, the record does not choose. The tapered brick wells at Mohenjo-Daro were excavated carefully, the trowels working down the shaft as the soil was removed in layers, the wedge-shaped bricks emerging one by one in the sequence they had been placed, still interlocking, still holding the shape of the cylinder that had been cut down through the earth to the water table. In some wells, the excavators found small objects that had fallen or been dropped in over the centuries of use, fragments of pottery, a bead, accumulated silt from seasons of drawing water. The water itself was long gone. The water table that the original builders had reached had dropped over the millennia since the city was occupied, and the bottom of the shaft opened into dry ground. But the shaft itself held. The geometry of the tapered bricks, calculated to resist the inward pressure of surrounding soil, had kept its form through 4,000 years of burial, through the weight of the meters of sediment above it, through the seasonal expansion and contraction of the soil around it as moisture levels changed. The well was still a well in its structure. It had simply been waiting, in the dark beneath the street, for the trowel to find it again. The street drain, whose capstone could be lifted for cleaning, was found the same way, its cover still in place, the channel beneath it still in its original form, the slight slope of the floor still directing toward the outer edge of the city. The removable stone had been replaced for the last time by whoever last cleaned the drain, perhaps in the final years of the city's occupation, and it had stayed there, covering its channel, until the excavator's trowel reached it from above. The drain did not know it had been forgotten. It simply was what it had been built to be, waiting in the expected silence of a buried thing. The bathing platforms in the courtyard houses were found with their drain holes still intact, the connections through the wall to the external channel still traceable, the bricks of the sloped floor still in their original positions, still angled toward the corner where the water was supposed to go. Rooms built for a specific daily human act, standing on a clean brick floor and pouring water over the body, or having water poured and watching it flow away, still holding the shape of that act in their geometry, in the direction of the slope and the placement of the hole, long after the people who performed the act were gone. There is something in this that resists summary. The word egalitarian has been used in descriptions of Indus urban planning, and the word carries more ideological weight than the physical evidence can comfortably bear. The word communal has been used, and it too imports assumptions about conscious social philosophy that the archaeology does not confirm. What the physical evidence shows, more precisely what it shows, and nothing more than what it shows, is a series of choices made by the people who planned and built these cities about where investment should go and who should benefit from it. The choices produced a citywide drainage network. They produced 700 wells. They produced bathing facilities and houses across the social range. They produced wide, maintained streets in a city built on a grid that organized movement and life in a legible, consistent pattern. Whether those choices were made by a philosophical commitment to shared civic life, by a practical understanding of what kept a dense urban population healthy and therefore productive, by a tradition so old it no longer required justification, or by some combination of these and other factors the record cannot name, that question is open. It has been open since the cities were first excavated in the 1920s. It remains open now. The careful restraint of honest scholarship is to note the physical facts and to hold the interpretive conclusions loosely, because the interpretive conclusions depend on assumptions about human motivation that the Indus civilization did not document and may not have expressed in any form the archaeology has yet recovered. What is available is the infrastructure itself, the channel and the capstone, and the well shaft and the bathing slab, and the covered drain, and the wide street, all of it built with the attention to material permanence that characterizes everything else the Indus civilization made. The bricks fired to a consistent ratio, the mortar applied with care to the joints, the tapered bricks calculated to hold without mortar in the curved shaft, the bitumen applied to the floor of the great bath to make it watertight. A civilization that knew how to build things to last, and chose throughout its urban period to apply that knowledge to the conditions of daily life at every scale, from the city's infrastructure to the floor of a single room. The drain capstones in the streets of Mohenjo-Daro were made from the same fired brick as everything else. They were shaped to fit their openings, set in place, left there to be lifted when the channel required attention. The channel required attention periodically. Silt accumulates, debris collects. A covered drain in an occupied city is a drain that is always being used and always, therefore, in need of maintenance. Someone was responsible for the maintenance. Whether that responsibility was distributed among households according to which section of drain ran past their door, or organized by a civic authority that assigned workers and schedules, or managed through some arrangement, the archaeology has not been able to illuminate. The record does not say. It says only that the system was built to allow maintenance. The removable capstone is the evidence for that, and the removable capstone is in the end a very small thing to carry a very large amount of meaning. It carries it nonetheless. The decision to make a drain cover removable is a decision made at the moment of design, before a single stone is laid, before the channel is built or the street is paved above it. It is a decision that looks forward in time, that imagines the city continuing to exist, continuing to need its drains to function, and that builds the access for that future maintenance into the present construction. A disposable drain, or a drain meant to serve only until the city's founder died and a monument replaced it, would not have been built this way. The removable capstone is a statement, in the modest grammar of a fired brick, that this city was built to keep going. The wells make the same statement in a different material. 700 of them, distributed through the neighborhoods, each one a shaft of tapered brick descending to the water table, each one engineered to stand without mortar by the geometry of its own components, each one present in the street, or the courtyard, or the narrow lane of a residential quarter, so that the need for water, the oldest and most basic of human needs in a hot climate, would not require more travel than the nearest intersection. The wells expected the city to be full of people. They were built in proportion to that expectation. They were placed to serve it, and they were built in the neighborhoods where ordinary people lived, not clustered near the elevated citadel mound, not concentrated in the zones of larger houses. Present across the city, in the expected proportion of a resource considered necessary enough to distribute rather than centralize, shared enough to be placed near whoever would need it, rather than managed from a single point where access could be controlled. The light in those neighborhoods, in the early morning, before the heat of the Indus plain arrived fully, would have fallen along the main thoroughfares and into the side lanes. The streets were wide enough to let it reach the walls of the courtyard houses. The wells in their lanes caught it at the rim. The drain covers in the streets were flush with the paving, catching no more light than the stone around them, doing their work invisibly, as all good infrastructure does. The city went about the business of being a city, drawing water and pouring it away, laying brick floors and sleeping on them, and waking and going out into streets planned at right angles to each other, on a grid that had been thought through and committed to before the first house was built. The people who lived in these houses are not individually recoverable. They left no names in the record. They left their houses, built to a broadly consistent courtyard plan. Their bathing platforms sloped toward their drain holes, their wells wedge-bricked and precisely cylindrical in the earth beneath their streets. They left the infrastructure, which is a kind of record, not of individuals, not of rulers or dynasties or named authorities, but of choices made about what a city was for and who it was for. The choices are visible in the physical fabric of the place, in the drain and the well and the bathing slab and the wide maintained street, and they are as present and as silent and as open to interpretation as everything else the Indus civilization left behind. A single Mohenjo-Daro well, excavated from the surface downward, its tapered brick shaft emerging layer by layer as the soil was removed, stands now as a visible structure in the archaeological site, open to the air again after 4,000 years, its bricks still holding their formation, the geometry of the wedge-shaped units still resisting the inward pressure of the earth around the shaft. The water table is far below it, the opening at the top, worn smooth at the rim where hands rested for centuries, catches the light of whatever sky is above it now. No inscription says whose well it was. No text records the name of the engineer who calculated the angle of the taper, or the workers who fired the bricks and lowered them into the earth one ring at a time. The well stands in the record of the city as the drainage channels stand in it and the bathing platforms stand in it, as evidence of a particular and sustained way of thinking about what the people who lived in a place were owed by the place itself, built in fired brick and gentle geometry, still holding its shape in the quiet of whatever afternoon finds it. The mounds of Rakagari rise above the roofline of the village that has grown around them. Low earthen rises in a flat Harana landscape, their surfaces scattered with worn brick fragments, the color of dried clay. The contemporary village sits above them, the way a later century always sits above an earlier one, unaware of the full weight of what it rests on. Excavation surveys have identified the site's extent at 550 hectares or more, which would make it the largest single settlement of the entire Indus Valley Civilization ever located, larger than Mohenjo-Daro, larger than Harappa, larger than any of the cities that have shaped 4,000 years of scholarly understanding of this civilization. Most of it remains beneath inhabited ground. The full dimensions of what lies below have not yet been established, and in all likelihood will not be established within any single lifetime of work. There is something particular about a site like this, a city of that scale, its outlines traced but its interior still sealed, a living community going about its days above streets that were laid in fired brick 4,000 years ago. The surface tells a partial story. Brick fragments at the soil surface, worn smooth by seasonal rains, have traveled upward through the mound over centuries of erosion, arriving at the present from somewhere much deeper. Each fragment still holds its fired proportions, its original kiln heat visible in the color of its cross-section, its edges worn, but its substance unchanged. Below those fragments, somewhere in the stratigraphy that excavators have only partially opened, the rooms and drains and wells and courtyards of the largest Indus city yet identified are waiting in the same dark they have kept since the city was gradually abandoned, sometime around or after 1900 BCE. The work at Rakhigarhi has moved slowly, as careful archaeological work at a site of this complexity must. Vasant Shinde and his colleagues have opened sections at different points across the mound, establishing the site's approximate boundaries and recovering material that has begun to clarify its relationship to other Indus cities. The material recovered so far, pottery, seals, inscribed objects, human remains from the associated cemetery, is consistent with what the wider civilization produced across its full geographic range. The standardized brick ratios appear. The seals with their short inscriptions and animal figures appear. The drainage infrastructure appears where excavation has gone deep enough to find it. The consistency is the same consistency found at every other major Indus site, repeated here at a scale that has not been fully reckoned with yet. That consistency is one of the things that has made the civilization so difficult to interpret from a purely political standpoint. The same proportions, the same material standards, the same urban infrastructure, repeated at sites separated by hundreds, and in some cases more than 1,000 kilometers, and no named authority, no palace, no monument to any individual to explain how that consistency was achieved or maintained. Rakhigarhi sits within that same pattern. It is, by its physical dimensions, the largest expression of that pattern yet found, and what its full interior contains, what structures occupy its unexcavated neighborhoods, what its cemetery holds across its full extent, what its material record will eventually show about how power and resources were organized in what may have been the civilization's largest single city, remains for now a question the soil has not yet returned. The decline of the Indus urban system was not a sudden event. The record shows something more gradual and more complicated than a single catastrophic ending, a process that unfolded over centuries at different paces in different places, with different local outcomes that the archaeological evidence is only beginning to distinguish from one another. The period between roughly 1900 and 1700 BCE shows, across the excavated major sites, a consistent pattern of declining building quality. The carefully fitted fired bricks that had defined the urban period begin to give way to less regular construction. The standardized weights that had underwritten long-distance trade in commodities, small cuboid stones cut to a precise system of ratios, found across sites from Mohenjo-Daro to the distant trading posts of the Persian Gulf, begin to disappear from the archaeological record. The large-scale drainage systems that had moved wastewater through covered channels beneath the streets fall out of maintenance and eventually out of use. These changes did not happen all at once, and they did not happen identically at every site. Some eastern settlements along the river systems of what is now Haryana and the Punjab show continued activity, and in some cases increased population density during the period when the major western cities were in decline. The evidence suggests something closer to a reorganization of settlement patterns, a movement of population from larger, more complex urban centers towards smaller and more dispersed communities, rather than a uniform collapse that erased the civilization across its full geographic range in a single event. The people did not vanish. The cities changed, shrank, and in many cases were eventually abandoned, but the populations that had built and inhabited them moved, adapted, and continued. The question of what drove that process has occupied researchers for decades without arriving at a settled answer. Several different mechanisms have been proposed, and most researchers who have examined the evidence in detail believe that more than one of them was operating simultaneously. The river systems that had supported Indus agriculture were themselves changing during the period of urban decline, and the evidence for that change has become increasingly legible through methods that were not available to the original excavators. A study published in 2012, led by Liviu Giosin and colleagues, used satellite imagery and geomorphological survey data to document the behavior of the Ghaggar Hakra river system, the ancient waterway running through what is now the Thar Desert region of Pakistan and northwestern India, along whose banks a dense concentration of Indus settlements has been identified. What the satellite imagery revealed was a series of paleochannels, the preserved traces of river courses that had shifted or dried over millennia, visible from altitude as pale, curving lines in the desert surface, distinct in color and texture from the surrounding terrain. Along those pale lines, now hundreds of kilometers from any reliable water source, the survey identified clusters of Indus settlement sites, small mounds, surface scatters of pottery and brick, the remains of communities that had been established beside a river that no longer exists. The Giosin study proposed that a gradual weakening of monsoon rainfall, beginning around 2500 BCE and continuing through the following centuries, had progressively reduced the flow of the Ghaggar Hakra system, undermining the agricultural base that supported the eastern concentration of Indus cities and smaller settlements. As the river contracted and eventually dried in its main channels, the communities dependent on its water for both irrigation and daily use faced a sustained pressure that the urban infrastructure, the wells, the drainage systems, the granaries, the long-distance trade networks, could buffer for a time, but not indefinitely. The evidence suggests that the response, where the evidence is available to trace it, was gradual relocation rather than catastrophic death in place. The paleo-channel lines are still visible. A satellite image of the Thar Desert region at the right resolution and in the right light conditions shows the ghost of a river system that once supported one of the densest concentrations of human settlement in the ancient world. The river is gone. Its path remains encoded in the different mineral content of the sediment it left behind, readable from altitude by the slight difference in reflectance that distinguishes ancient channel fill from the surrounding desert surface. Along those invisible banks, the settlement sites wait in the soil, most of them not yet excavated, most of them not yet fully identified, the slow trowel work of their investigation still ahead. The older theory of what ended Mohenjo-Daro specifically, the one that dominated popular understanding of the civilization's fate for several decades after it was proposed, rested on a very different kind of evidence. During excavations carried out in the 1920s and 1930s, a small number of skeletal remains were found scattered across the upper occupation layers of Mohenjo-Daro, some of them in positions that the excavators of the time interpreted as indicating sudden violent death. Mortimer Wheeler, the archaeologist whose work in the 1940s did much to establish the Indus Valley Civilization's place in the broader understanding of ancient history, developed these scattered bones into a theory of massacre, an interpretation linking the city's end to the arrival of Indo-Aryan populations from the northwest. The same migrations that Wheeler connected to the composition of the Rigveda's references to destroyed strongholds. The theory was vivid, and for a time it was influential. It gave the civilization's end a specific shape, a violent displacement, an urban culture overwhelmed by incoming populations, the cities abandoned in the aftermath of conflict. The problem was that the physical evidence, examined with more precise methods than Wheeler had available, did not support it. Kenneth Kennedy, a physical anthropologist who analyzed the skeletal material in detail, found that the remains were not contemporaneous with one another. They did not share a consistent date within the archaeological stratigraphy. They showed no pattern of injury consistent with a coordinated attack, no clustering of traumatic wounds, no evidence of the kind of simultaneous mass death that a massacre would leave in the bone record. What the bones more likely represented, Kennedy concluded, was a small number of individuals from different periods of the city's late occupation who had died and for various reasons had not been formally buried, unburied dead from a city that was already in decline, not the victims of a single violent event. The massacre theory has not had a significant presence in the mainstream archaeological literature for several decades. The evidence that was used to build it turned out, on closer examination, not to bear the weight of the interpretation placed upon it. The city's end remains unclear in its specific causes and its precise timeline, but the image of a violent conquest has been replaced by something more difficult to picture, and in some ways more genuinely strange, a slow process of abandonment, the infrastructure falling quiet, the population dispersing in ways the record can trace only approximately, the city gradually returning to the soil it had been built above. What the record shows, in place of a dramatic ending, is a series of quiet signals. The drainage channels that had carried wastewater beneath the streets go unmaintained and eventually fall out of use. Buildings that had been maintained through multiple phases of repair and reconstruction stop being repaired. Walls that collapse are not rebuilt. The areas of the city that remained occupied in the latest phases are smaller than the areas occupied at the urban peak, the settlement contracting toward its center or toward particular neighborhoods, while other districts are abandoned. The material culture of those late phases shows signs of simplification, fewer imported goods, fewer of the standardized weights that indicate participation in long-distance trade, pottery of less consistent quality. The civilization's urban system was not cut down. It wound slowly down, the complex infrastructure of an interconnected civilization gradually losing the conditions, the population, the trade networks, the agricultural surpluses, the water supply that had made its complexity possible. The people who had lived in those cities did not, in the genetic sense, disappear. The study published in the journal Cell in September of 2019 based on ancient DNA recovered from burials at the Rakagari Cemetery, provided evidence bearing directly on this question. The ancient DNA extracted from those burials showed that the individuals from the Rakigarhi Cemetery were genetically distinct from populations associated with the Eurasian steppe, carrying no significant ancestry from the steppe populations that some researchers have proposed as major contributors to the genetic composition of later South Asian populations. The Rakagari individuals showed genetic connections to South Asian populations across a broad geographic range, suggesting that the people of the Indus Valley Civilization contributed substantially to the ancestry of the people who live in South Asia today. The study established what it could establish from the specific sample it analyzed, which was limited in size and drawn from a single cemetery at a single site. It did not resolve, and did not claim to resolve, the broader and more complicated questions about the timing, scale, and genetic impact of population movements from the steppe into South Asia during the second millennium BCE, questions that remain actively debated in the ancient DNA literature and that the Rakigari paper itself explicitly left open. What the study contributed was a data point of genuine significance, that the people buried in this cemetery at this city were ancestral in meaningful ways to South Asians living thousands of years later. The Indus people did not vanish. They became, in part, the people who came after them. That continuity is difficult to hold in the mind alongside the scale of what was lost. The urban system, the drainage infrastructure, the long-distance trade networks, the writing system, none of these survived the decline of the cities in any form that the archaeological record has yet identified as continuous with what came after. The script, if it was ever read again in the centuries following the urban period, left no trace of that reading in any material form that has been recovered. The standardized weights that had made trade across such large distances possible disappear from the record. The fired brick construction that had defined the cities gives way, in the post-urban period, to less durable materials. Whatever organizational system had maintained the consistency of the civilization across its full geographic range, whatever network of communication and mutual agreement had enforced the same brick ratios and the same drainage standards from Mohenjo-Daro to Dolovara to the small trading posts of the Gujarat coast, that system dissolved and did not reappear. What replaced it was different, and the process by which the different things that came after were connected to the civilization that preceded them is one of the genuinely unresolved questions in South Asian archaeology and history. The Vedic culture that emerges in the textual record of the second millennium and later centuries BCE is connected to the Indus civilization's geographic region and to the genetic ancestry of the people who inhabited it. But the specific links between the two, whether any Indus religious practices, administrative structures, or social forms survived into the Vedic period in traceable ways, have not been established in the archaeological record in any form that commands consensus. The question sits at the boundary of what the existing evidence can resolve, and responsible work in the field tends to mark that boundary clearly, rather than filling it with inference. A specimen jar in the laboratory archive at Deccan College in Pune holds soil and material recovered from the Rakigari burial context that produced the ancient DNA analyzed in the 2019 study. It is a specific physical object, labeled, dated, cataloged, stored in the institution's climate-controlled storage, alongside the other material from that excavation. The jar holds the remains of a physical chain of evidence, the burial context from which the bone fragments were extracted, the extraction process that yielded genetic material, old enough and well enough preserved to be sequenced, the sequencing work carried out in the laboratory, the analysis that produced the paper published in Cell, that chain of evidence is physical at every stage. Soil and bone and extracted DNA and the computational outputs of the sequencing machines and the specimen jar is part of it, sitting in institutional storage as the conversation it contributed to continues in other laboratories and other papers and other excavations. This is one of the qualities of archaeological evidence that gives the work its particular character. The material that produced a finding in 2019 continues to exist. It sits in labeled storage. It can, in principle, be reanalyzed as methods improve, recontextualized as new material from other sites becomes available, brought back into a conversation that was not finished in the year the original paper was published. The Rakhigarhi Cemetery has not been fully excavated. The site itself has not been fully excavated. Future excavation seasons at Rakhigarhi and at the dozens of other Indus sites that remain only partially investigated will produce material that will change, refine, and in some cases overturn the interpretations that the current state of the evidence supports. The scholarship is not finished, and the physical evidence, the soil and bone and fired steatite and gypsum and brick that the scholarship is built from is mostly still in the ground. The questions that have accumulated across more than a century of excavation and analysis of the Indus Valley Civilization remain largely where they were when the first major sites were opened. The script has not been read. No named ruler has been identified. No structure has been confirmed as a palace. The organizational system that maintains such remarkable consistency across such large distances has not been explained in terms that satisfy everyone who has examined the evidence. The decline of the urban system has been documented in broad outline, but not in the specific details that would allow a confident account of what happened to any particular city in its final decades of occupation. The genetic record is beginning to clarify some questions about population ancestry and continuity, but the questions it has clarified are not the same questions as the ones about political organization and social structure that the material culture raises, and the script, if it were legible, might answer. There is a way to sit with that accumulation of open questions that does not feel like frustration. The questions are the shape of the subject itself, the outline of a civilization that did not want or did not need or simply did not choose to leave the particular kinds of records that would have made it legible in the ways that Mesopotamia and Egypt are legible. The civilization was real. Its cities were built with extraordinary care and skill. Its people lived in them, drew water from the wells, bathed in the brick-floored bathrooms, pressed their seals into clay to seal containers in transit across hundreds of kilometers of ancient trade routes. 4,000 years of soil have not changed those basic facts. What the soil has changed is access to the texture of those lives, the names, the language, the political arrangements, the beliefs that the inscriptions on the seals were recording, and the soil, being soil, has made no particular apology for what it has consumed. The Rann of Kutch in the dry season is one of the quieter landscapes on Earth. The salt flats extend in every direction from the raised ground where Dolavira was built, flat and white and almost completely without relief, the sky above them very large and very pale. Dolavira sits on the island of Kader Bet, which rises just enough above the surrounding salt plain to have made it a reliable habitation site when the rainfall was sufficient to fill the elaborate reservoir system that the city's planners had cut into the rock at its perimeter. The reservoirs are still there, carved channels and stone-faced embankments, the most elaborate water management infrastructure of any Indus site yet excavated, built to capture and hold monsoon runoff in a landscape where the seasonal rains were the only reliable water source. In the dry season, the reservoirs are empty. The salt flats surrounding the island shimmer in the heat. Near the northern gateway of Dolavira, in the soil where the gateway's wooden threshold and supporting structure have long since returned to the earth, the excavations led by R.S. Bisht in the 1990s found something that had not been found at any other Indus site. The gypsum inlay of the Dolavira signboard, 10 large signs, each made of white gypsum set into a wooden backing. The whole panel, estimated at approximately 3 meters in width, had collapsed into the soil when the wood decayed and the individual gypsum pieces had settled into the earth in something close to their original arrangement. The signs were each large enough to be read from a distance, which is to say they were large enough to function as public display in a way that no other Indus inscription had been built to function. A seal pressed into clay is meant to be held and examined. The Dolavira signboard was mounted at a gateway where a city's population and its visitors would pass beneath it, and the signs on it were large enough to be read without approaching closely. The signs themselves are still legible in shape. The gypsum fragments that made up each sign survived the decay of their wooden backing and the 4,000 years of dry desert soil that followed, and when the excavators found them, they were still holding the forms they had been cut to hold. 10 signs, their approximate sequence determinable from the positions in which they had fallen, their physical shapes preserved by the dry conditions of the Ran of Cook. The shapes are known. They are part of the Indus sign corpus, comparable to signs found on seals from across the civilization's geographic range. What they mean has not been established. The inscription is the most publicly displayed text the civilization is known to have produced, mounted at a city gate to be read by everyone who entered or left, and its content is completely unknown. That combination, the physical presence of the signs, the clear intention of public communication, the complete opacity of the message, is one of the places where the mystery of the Indus Valley Civilization feels most specifically located. Most of the civilization's inscriptions are small and private, pressed into seals meant to be held in a hand and read at close range. The Dolavira signboard was public in scale and public in placement, and it has survived in a form that allows its physical presence to be understood even while its content remains inaccessible. The city's inhabitants knew exactly what it said. The traders who passed through the northern gate knew what it said. Whatever the signs recorded, a name, a title, a civic designation, a statement about the city or its governance or its relationship to the broader world, was understood by everyone who saw it as immediately and unremarkably as a city gate inscription is understood by those who live beside it. The wood is gone. The gypsum remains. The white mineral fragments that made up those 10 signs are still resting in the soil near the northern gateway of Dolavira. Some of them removed and studied by the excavators, some of them still in their approximate original positions in the earth. The inscription is still mounted at the gate, in its way, not on its wooden backing, not in its original vertical plane, but present in the soil that the gate once stood above, the gypsum holding its cut shapes in the dry Ran of Cook, earth, just as it has held them since the wood behind it decayed and the panel settled slowly into the ground. The city that the gate once opened into is also still present in the same qualified sense. The streets are below the current soil surface. The reservoirs are cut into the bedrock and cannot be removed by time in the way that wood and organic material can be removed. The large stone-faced embankments of the water management system remain. Dry now, the monsoon water they were built to capture, no longer running in the quantities that would have filled them during the urban period. The citadel area, with its elaborate series of enclosures and carefully graduated public spaces, is still legible in its basic plan. The lower town, where the residential population lived, is excavated in sections, but not in its entirety. Below the excavated sections, more rooms wait, more drains, more wells of the tapered brick type, their shafts descending to a water table that has dropped far below the level at which they could serve anyone. This is the condition of the Indus Valley Civilization in the present, not gone, but mostly below ground, available in fragments, and in the careful inferences that can be drawn from fragments. Patient in the way that soil is patient, which is to say entirely without impatience, the material simply present in the earth at whatever depth it has reached across the millennia of its burial.